Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We are joined today with Elder Larry Grant to welcome us to the traditional territory of the Musqueam. Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. CEM te siaya ayaslak gunasquih y tenitin at Musqueam. Clark says Yoenes, Pipolano, Quis Helixto, the Quinas, E. McNetten, Quishwa E. Tesal Tamukat from Musqueam. So Equinus Yoenes, Pipolano, sets something need to swallow. E. Helixtala, Tamukolab, Quis Clear. Tana whale should eat just sans tamok at UBC. Hi Tepe Siam Nasia see us I say thank you for having me here today to do the land acknowledgement and the greeting. Our ancestor was here to greet the first ship under the Spanish Captain Narvaez, and the first ship under Captain George Vancouver, the Englishman. And as our ancestor did in the past, I do today and raise my hands in welcome to all of you that are here this afternoon, logged on, and want to say welcome to the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Hunt speaking Musqueam people, as our ancestor had done. And it's a real pleasure to be able to bring forward those words of greeting for this conference on ecological emergency, climate emergency. And it's really something that I think that's dear to all of our hearts as people that have been here for thousands of years without having to worry about the climate change that was exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution. And now that we have it here, we need to be able to be sincerely involved in climate change issues and not just bartering with carbon credits back and forth and still maintaining the status quo in how we are polluting the environment. And I want to say thank you for all of our people that have been ecologically responsible in the way our lives have carried on, even during all of this industrial upheaval that has also been a part of our lives also, because the change has been so great and rapid. And we would like to take more responsibility throughout the industrial world so that it slows it down to the point where we can work with it. And I'll leave it at that. And I want to say again, Colette Quincy Theatala, to swell up a inamet to not whale, to eat, to sound public from Musqueam. Hi, Jeff Garcia, Nasia. Thank you.
Hi, Chikasiam. Goodness cheese. Thank you. Shonithan. Thank you, Elder Larry Grant, for always welcoming us with warmth and sharing a glimpse into your life's journey. I feel like you always teach me how I can work to be in better relationship with everything that nurtures us. So good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining us from across the country and perhaps around the world. And wherever you find yourself today, I sincerely hope that you and your loved ones are healthy and you're safe. And I thank you for joining us today. So welcome to UBC's inaugural Climate Emergency Week. In Jawa Insquashli Shetko and Danke Kagala Uye. My English name is, of course, Nadia Jo, and I comprise one half of UBC's newly established Climate Emergency team. But I do not carry the weight of this work alone. As a global issue, this is, of course, demanding of a collective response. And for those of us here at UBC, the response to the climate emergency is a shared responsibility across all campus members and our partners. Our teams at the Sustainability Hub acknowledge the strength of coordinated climate action. And so one of our key priorities at the Sustainability Hub is to create connection and to build community among all partners that are working towards a just and sustainable future. So it has been within this spirit of community that our team has been working with several campus partners, including the Climate Hub, AMS, and others, to offer a week of events and activities that seeks to renew our collective commitments to climate action, and also really just to celebrate each other's strengths, our energies and passions in mobilizing change. We've also received some generous funding support from PICS and UBC Wellbeing in these events. This week also coincides with the AMS Sustainability Week and the Move UBC campaign. We also acknowledge Black History Month. And today there are many marching at the 31st Annual Women's Memorial March that honors and grieves the sisters in Vancouver's downtown east side that never came home. We invite you to join one of the many events that you can find on our website, and you will be able to see this in the chat box at the end of the event. And we also invite you in a show of solidarity with other climate leaders on campus to wear a splash of red this week and to post about your thoughts, your experiences, and ideas on social media using the hashtag UBC Climate Love. Now, turning our attention to today's very special event, we wanted to ground this week's conversations in the awareness that the effects of the climate crisis will not be borne equally. While this was once viewed solely as an environmental issue, the climate crisis stems from historic inequalities, decades and perhaps centuries in the making. Specifically, Indigenous and Black communities are noted as being most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And so resolving the climate crisis cannot be achieved if we only focus on the technical and policy solutions that have so far eluded us. Effective climate action must bend towards justice. Addressing the social inequities laid bare by this emergency demands a new approach, one that centers care for the health and well-being of our planet and all living communities that depend upon it. And so much of the vision behind this event for this week has come from the love and the care and the passion of my colleague, my co-manager, my friend, the ever generous and ever kind, Mr. Pablo Beimler. Pablo, I turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And again, thank you so much, Elder Larry Grant, for opening us up in such a great way. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's a really exciting week too. And I'm just incredibly fortunate also to be sharing this role alongside of you, Nadia, and someone I've also grown to know well, and I'm constantly inspired by the energy and wisdom and kindness and intentionality you bring to this work. My personal winding climate journey has most recently landed me in this position, sparked by my previous involvement in the Climate Hub at UBC as its academic lead, while also working on my master's in community and regional planning. I was constantly inspired, moved, and energized by my fellow student peers and friends who made enormous sacrifices in their time and energy to advocate and organize for a livable planet and a more just university and society, and doing so through creativity and intentionality while building community. It is this type of activism that has sparked the enormous changes in the conversations and actions that this very university has taken in response to the climate crisis over the past few years. Riding, or better yet, acting as one of the many epicenters of the massive wave of global 2019 youth-led climate strikes, UBC students wrote an open letter to the university's leadership to declare a climate emergency that September. This spurred the creation of a task force, an extensive engagement process throughout 2020, organized and hosted by the Climate Hub. The incredible turnout from diverse participants led to interesting discussions and input that was then shared with working groups of students, staff, and faculty, tasked with developing recommendations for specific themes, ultimately resulting in the final report and recommendations document that was sent to the Sustainability and Climate Action Board Committee in February 2021 and endorsed by the Board of Governors shortly after, so a full year ago. The report centers on 9 strategic priorities that focus on the broad spectrum of systemic changes needed to advance UBC's commitment and responsibility towards climate leadership and global partnership. Since the task force was endorsed, there have been many new or expanded partnerships, initiatives, programs, and research and education opportunities across UBC. Several of these have been initiated through the $1.5 million Climate Emergency Fund, which was mobilized through student advocacy from the Climate Hub and AMS. UBC's Climate Emergency at its heart is an exercise in introspection and an opportunity to demonstrate a holistic, university-wide approach towards acting on the climate crisis. It is rooted by climate justice and has been seeded by the incredible and persistent advocacy of students. Acknowledging the pressing need to find connection and community among everyone working towards resolving this crisis, especially for our students, we're offering a full week of events and activities that seek to renew, re-energize, and reconvene our UBC climate action communities. So how can you get involved? Each day, there are numerous opportunities for you to join either in person or virtually, including nature walk, roll, strolls, hosted by the Climate Hub and Move UBC, the Climate Hub's Climate Kiosk, and the Sustainability Hub's booth by the Central Fountain on Main Mall. Tuesday and Thursday, we are hosting roundtables as opportunities for students to share your input and ideas on where UBC should go next in its climate emergency response. Wednesday, we are hosting an exciting panel and dialogue of UBC student and administrative leaders to hear from their priorities and vision for the climate emergency and to hear questions from you. On Friday, we close out with a celebratory hybrid event at the AMS Nest Atrium with honorary guest Chief Dana Tisha Tram from Vantukgwitchin First Nation, who are demonstrating inspiring leadership in addressing the climate crisis. And Musqueam Knowledge Keeper Victor Garin will close us out in a good way through drumming and song. In planning this event, we want to amplify the voices and visions of UBC's students, especially those who demonstrate such love, energy, and commitment to the climate crisis, to climate leadership. And in many ways, our event's moderator today, Temitope Onifade, embodies the spirit of climate action and leadership at UBC. Temitope Onifade is a Vanier scholar at UBC. He is a sociological expert studying the low carbon agenda, climate justice, and Africa's sustainable development. He co-founded the Liu Institute Network for Africa UBC. He works for the Canada Climate Law Initiative UBC and has worked for Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, University of Oxford. We've had the pleasure of working with Temi this past fall as he was one of the COP26 delegates representing UBC, and I'm honored to introduce you all to him. So Temi, take it away.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and that's such a kind introduction. I must start by saying many thanks to you and Nadia and many other members of the fabulous UBC Sustainability Hub for putting so much work into this kind of initiative, having this kind of week, and then asking me to contribute in a very small way. I didn't imagine this week could happen during my time at UBC, but here we are. So I'm very grateful. I will provide an overview of the connection between climate emergency, climate justice, and environmental justice before introducing our keynote speaker today. So let me start by positioning myself in the climate conversation to give a sense of where I am coming from. So I'm from an indigenous African tribe called Yoruba in the southwest of Nigeria. As a child, I learned about sustainability, but no one around me called it that. For instance, while my family didn't depend on hunting for food, we farmed and processed our food at home, and I hunted in groups with other young people. Later, I went to university in my tribe's most ancient and spiritual town called Ile-Ife, and then to law school in Nigeria's Federal Capital Territory, Abuja. I learned nothing about climate at both places. I started seeing more about environmental issues after becoming a lawyer practicing in the Niger Delta in 2010. Eventually, I moved my practice to Southwest Nigeria at the end of 2011, where I struggled to get low carbon incentives for clients dealing in renewable energy resources and technologies. I faced several economic, political barriers, ranging from ignorance to corruption complicated by a history of military rule in Nigeria. And I became interested in learning more about how to address these problems in climate policy. So I came to Canada in 2014 for that purpose. Since arriving in Canada, I have learned about even more complex environment-related problems, especially the relations between Indigenous legal orders and the Crown legal system, which has been influenced by colonialism, of course. So adding to my background in the Niger Delta and Southwest Nigeria, my journey in Canada has taught me a lot about what we recently started calling the climate emergency. So for instance, I have learned through my involvement in UBC, Vancouver, Alberta, Newfoundland and Labrador, and British Columbia, of course, also the government of Canada and the United Nations, climate policy research and engagement. So from what I have learned, what is this climate emergency framing? Most of us know that climate change is the most complex environmental problem, if not most complex problem ever. Facing us, right? But framing it as an emergency brings a sense of seriousness and urgency that we didn't have just a couple of years ago. This framing happens more at the grassroots. So if you think about local governments and local organizations, like we have framed it in Vancouver, right? And at UBC. So different governments and organizations use this emergency framework to serve diverse purposes, but they all agree that we need to change the way we do things and that our leaders must step up to mitigate emissions based on the scientific evidence, resources such as technology and finance, and our laws. Now, if you note what I just said, right? Emphasis on three key things: scientific evidence, resources, and laws. Now, this is where the climate emergency framing alone is grossly inadequate. Influenced by traditional climate policy approaches, governments, community leaders, university administrators, and other leaders across levels can declare a climate emergency and then focus on mainly using laws, science, technology, finance, and markets for actions reducing emissions. My question is, what does all this mean for the poor people? What does it mean for marginalized and weak people and places that we usually call the vulnerable in the climate field? The good news is that climate justice makes up for this inherited short-sightedness of the climate emergency framework. As another way of thinking about climate change and solutions, climate justice emphasizes putting the vulnerable at the center of action. So to be clear, climate justice, and those of us who write about it, do not say leaders should not use laws, science, technology, finance, and markets to address climate change. What we're saying is that the ultimate purpose of using these resources should be to make the lives of the vulnerable better, especially people most impacted by climate change and their actions to address it, rather than pursuing some other values that may benefit the rich, powerful, and other privileged groups and individuals. For instance, what's the point about strict emissions reduction based on carbon pricing and technology investments that do not tell us how to help the most impacted? In essence, what I'm saying is that there are winners and losers in climate action, so we must pay attention to them. I am proud of UBC for taking the lead in using the climate justice lens to inform our approach to the climate emergency. Just look at our climate justice declaration and the other things we have done as part of our climate emergency response. And you'd see that UBC frames climate problems around climate justice. Now, this is not to say that we do not still have problems, right? We have challenges. For instance, I've spoken to students, numerous student administrators, and our news reporters at UBC about ensuring accountability in implementation, enhancing the capacity of the UBC community to make more impacts, not only at UBC, but also in their research and teaching communities, and addressing loss and damage that we already know will be a challenge for our campuses and people. Going forward, These are areas I hope we will start paying close attention to. But for now, at this very moment, I think we should be thankful. As someone doing what some people would call a tough PhD program, I know very well that celebrating small steps and achievements motivate one to do more. So now I'd like to briefly unveil some building blocks of this all-important climate justice framework. The academic concepts and real-world experiences that contribute to the development of the climate justice framework are numerous. I do not intend to be exhaustive, but what they share is that they are all about thinking and doing justice. Think of concepts such as environmental justice, distributive justice, and global justice, and real-world problems that we face, such as the ones in the Niger Delta that I saw, and the Bhopal disaster in India, and most recently, the climate crisis at home here in British Columbia. Perhaps the best known of these concepts is environmental justice, which has been used to frame crises such as the one in the Niger Delta. Environmental justice is often said to be a movement that began in the United States to challenge the disproportionate impacts of environmental problems on vulnerable people, especially Black, Indigenous, and colored people. The concept has become global, and we will hear more about some real-world environmental justice issues in Canada from our keynote speaker. However, I want to be clear that the ideas behind environmental justice are not necessarily from the US, right? Every community has such issues, but most of the literature credits the US with that concept. So let me introduce our keynote speaker who will tell us more about our work in that area. Dr. Ingrid Waldron's work focuses on the structural and environmental determinants of health and mental health disparities in Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and refugee communities in Canada, including environmental racism, climate inequities, mental health, and COVID-19. Our speaker, Professor and Hope Chair in Peace and Health at McMaster University, is the author of There is Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which was turned into a 2020 Netflix documentary of the same name. That was so fun to see. Of note, and I was actually very excited to learn about this, Dr. Waldron's research and community advocacy work inspired the federal private members bill called A National Strategy Respecting Environmental Racism and Environmental Justice, otherwise known as Bill C-230. I'll now pass the mic to our esteemed guest, and we'll be asking our questions later. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Waldron. Over to you.
Thanks, Timmy. Okay, let me just put up my screen. I want to begin with a quote from the International Indian Treaty Council. And it says, from a traditional perspective, the health of our peoples cannot be separated from the health of our environment. The practice of our spirituality and the expression of our inherent right to self-determination, upon which the mental, physical, and social health of our communities is based. So across Canada, as we know, environmental racism and climate devastation has had negative social, political, and health effects in primarily Indigenous and Black communities. In this presentation, what I want to do is to examine the legacy of environmental chaos and resistance in these communities by examining the ecological, health, and social impacts of environmental racism and climate change inequities in Indigenous and Black communities, the intersection of environmental racism and climate justice. I want to look at where they intersect, what are some of the issues that they share, how my project, a project that I started in 2012, the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities and Community Health Project, the ENRICH project, how it's been trying to address environmental racism over the last, I guess, 9.5 years now. How community mobilizing in these communities and resistance, acts of resistance, have led to significant wins over the last several years. some, in my opinion, stunning wins in the past, specifically the past 2 years, and how organizations can address the impacts of environmental racism. So I want to just provide a quote of environmental racism. I had, as I said, began my project in 2012, and I had determined that it needed to be community-based and that I needed to meet the communities that were impacted because I wanted to hear from them about what I should be doing, which is not typical for professors. We typically, you know, we decide what the research objectives are and the questions, and then we put it into ethics, and that's that, right? And it's not typical that communities have a say in any of that. But what I wanted to do with these kind of regional meetings was to sit down in an informal way and ask these communities, what do you think I should be doing? What do you think my research questions and objectives should be? So that's what I did in the fall of 2013. And one of the communities was Lincolnville. Lincolnville is a rural, semi-rural, low-income African Nova Scotian community. And African Nova Scotians have been in Nova Scotia for over 300 years. So they are the oldest Black community in Canada, not an immigrant community, but a community where they are descendants of Black loyalists who went to Nova Scotia after the War of 1812. Descendants of people from Sierra Leone and people who are descendants of Jamaican Maroons. And I met with James and other individuals, a sit-down meeting, and we filmed these meetings. And this is what James said when we asked him to define environmental racism. He says the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. The reason I like to use this definition is because I think it's extremely simple, as you can see, but it's also extremely layered, because within that definition, he's talking about the fact that there's disproportionality, that certain communities that are racialized and low income, tend to be selected for the placement of hazardous projects. But he also says that these are communities that don't have a base to fight back. In other words, these are the communities that lack political, social, and economic clout, meaning these are communities that are rarely heard because they lack social, economic, and political clout. You will notice that he also talked about white communities, and typically we don't associate environmental racism with white communities. And typically, you know, it is Black and Indigenous communities, communities of color in the United States that are most impacted, but there are white communities that are impacted. So in Nova Scotia, for example, there's a community called Harrietsfield, a low-income rural white community that has been trying to address water contamination since the 1980s. And they haven't received justice as yet. So part of that is the fact that this is a low-income communities. We know that if you are more affluent, you have economic and political clout, you will more likely be heard by government. So it is certainly an issue of race and class and socioeconomic status when we're dealing with environmental racism. For me, race is salient, right? Because all of the communities, most of the communities happen to be racialized, but they are, of course, also low income, and they live in out of the way, rural or isolated communities. I also wanted to give you the kind of more academic definition of environmental racism. You probably heard of Dr. Robert Bullard. He's considered to be the father of environmental justice. He wrote a book called Dumping in Dixie in 1990. His wife is a lawyer and encouraged him to write about a case that she had taken on. And I had the pleasure of actually hosting him at a symposium in 2017 in Nova Scotia. So he's a bit of a hero to me. So it was thrilling actually to be able to host him. So in this 1993 article, he says that environmental racism is about the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution. So that's what James said in that photo earlier, right? He's saying that it's about disproportionality. Certain communities tend to be more selected. Bullard also says it's about the lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of these polluters in their communities. And once again, you know, even though James Desmond's quote was so short, he also talked about this. These are the communities that lack political power. They lack political clout. They're often not heard. When they are heard, cleanup tends to be very, very slow. He also says that it's about the implementation of policies. Well, environmental racism doesn't just happen. It happens as an outcome of environmental policies, right? Or of course, environmental assessments that are, an environmental assessment is a tool that's used to decide where a project goes. So environmental racism, the patterning of industry disproportionately in certain communities, is a result of environmental policies and decision-making. And I would often say that when racism is written or inscribed within policy in very subtle ways, sometimes it's not purposeful, but it's very subtle when we have particularly, ideologies about racialized communities that they are not worthy of protection, and that certain communities are worthy of protection. That's very subtle, right? But that's an ideology that often gets written into policy, and that results in the life-threatening presence of poisons in these communities. Bullard also says it's about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup. So all we have to do is look at communities that are impacted, communities that have been dealing with environmental racism for decades, and the slow response. When these communities get government to clean up their sites, it's often 40 or 50 years later, as is the case with Pictou Landing First Nation, Boat Harbour in Pictou Landing First Nations in Nova Scotia. So you have to ask why it takes so long for cleanup to happen. And then another definition that people often don't think about is the history of excluding the people who are most impacted from decision-making bodies. So these are the communities that don't get a seat at the table. So as they continue to not get a seat at the table, where they have opportunities to share their experiences, their priorities, engage in decision-making, since they are the communities that are most impacted, what happens intergenerationally is that environmental racism continues to happen. It's difficult to intervene on environmental racism if we are not listening to and incorporating into policy the priorities and concerns and ideas about how to intervene by the communities that are most impacted. So that's the more academic definition of environmental racism. I wanted to provide you with some case studies of cases of environmental racism over the last 70 years in Canada. I want to begin with where I started my work, which was in Nova Scotia, Sipekne'katik First Nation. Between 2014 and 2021, Sipekne'katik First Nation had opposed the development by Alton Gas of a brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River in Nova Scotia. I'm going to talk about outcomes later, but I'm just going to give you the case studies right now. You've got Boat Harbour, which I talked about briefly. So since 1967, a northern pulp mill had been dumping effluent into Boat Harbour in Pictou Landing, which the community says is connected to, and many of the communities that I've been connected with would say that there's a link between these toxins, these projects, and high rates of various illnesses like cancer, reproductive illnesses. The mill closed at the end of January 2020, but I will talk about that a bit later. We have Amdinwang First Nation, one of, I would say, the worst cases of environmental racism in Canada, along with Boat Harbour. So this is in Sarnia, Ontario, and Amdinwang First Nation is often, or the issue is often referred to as kind of Chemical Valley. It's named Chemical Valley often. It's a community that is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities, and this is a community that has communicated their concerns about these facilities because of the health impacts, similar health impacts that we see in other communities, reproductive illnesses, respiratory illness, etc. There's also Grassy Narrows First Nation in or near Kenora, Ontario, and they have long been concerned about the health effects of mercury contamination of the Wabigoon English River near their community. They had cleanup about 5 or 6 years ago, but of course the concerns about the health impacts remain. This issue has gotten probably the most attention over the last 4 years. Wet'suwet'en First Nation. Oh, you guys are you're in BC, so you're familiar with this issue. So over the past 5 years, perhaps, mass demonstrations, sit-ins, and blockades have gripped various parts of Canada over the movement to support leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposed to a multi-billion-dollar pipeline project in northern BC. There are also Black communities that are most impacted. I have found over the past few years that the Black communities that are most impacted tend to be in Nova Scotia. I don't have an answer for that. The only thing I can think of is that Black communities in Nova Scotia tend to live in isolated communities, rural communities. I would say 98% of them. There are about over 40 what we call historic African Nova Scotian communities. And there's only one that I can think of, which is the Black community in the North End, which has undergone gentrification, that I would consider to be an urban Black communities. The other communities tend to be in isolated areas. And as I said earlier, it's much easier to place dumps in isolated communities because these are out of the way communities that are often not heard. So that's my kind of answer to why this seems to be an issue in Nova Scotia, in Black Nova Scotia, than in other parts of Canada. However, of course, we can point to Scarborough, Ontario, Malvern particularly, which is predominantly Black, and they have petrochemical facilities near them as well. But I have found that this is an issue that seems to affect Black Nova Scotians more than any other. And this is an example of a historic Black community called Africville. And in the 1960s, the city of Halifax decided to push the community out, expropriate this community because they wanted to make way for new development. So I would say that Africville is a case study on gentrification or urban renewal in terms of wanting to make way for new development. But in the wake of that new development, were left various social and environmental hazards, right? So it's both gentrification, urban renewal, and environmental racism. Some of these environmental hazards in Africville include a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. And this was happening in the early to late 1960s. We've got Lincolnville. So I showed you a picture of James Desmond earlier, who defined environmental racism. This is his community. So this is a community that has been subjected to 2 landfills. The first one was placed in Lincolnville in 1974, and the second one was placed on top of the first generation landfill in 2006. You've got Shelburne. If you saw the film, the Netflix documentary, you would have met Louise DeLille from Shelburne. They have had a dump. It's called formally the Shelburne Town Dump, or the dump by the community. And they've had this dump in the community since 1942, 1943. And they would say that everything went into that dump. Of course, I'm going to talk about the winds later, but this dump was closed at the end of December 2016. And the community, this community, like many other communities, would say that extremely high rates of cancer and rare cancers like multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer, they would say it's due to this dump. I want to kind of intersect climate change, environmental racism to climate justice, because I think they're connected in very significant ways. So for me, there's a very clear connection between environmental racism, pollution and contamination, and climate devastation. So first, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities in the global North and South are disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis, just as these are the same communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental racism. And I think one of the reasons that, or one of the things that connects these 2 issues is that those structural determinants of health that expose Indigenous and Black communities to, for example, environmental racism are the same structural determinants of health that expose them to climate disasters. So it is the communities that are most vulnerable, the communities that are lacking in resources, the communities that are less equipped and prepared because of poverty, because of racism, because of a legacy of colonialism. Those are the communities that tend to get hit first and worst. Why? Because structural inequities within our social structures make them vulnerable in the first place. Poverty makes them vulnerable. Where they live makes them vulnerable. Often where they live, those places have fragile public infrastructure and built-in features of the built environment. Housing might be insecure and low quality. So those structural issues that make these communities vulnerable are, of course, climate change issues, because it means that they are less prepared, less equipped to deal with climate devastation before climate change hits. On the other side of it, they're less able, once again, to address and come back and recover from climate devastations for the same reasons I just mentioned, because they are low income, because they are poor in many cases, because they lack strong public infrastructure. So before climate change hits and after climate change hits, you've got communities that are vulnerable because of a legacy of racism and structural inequities. And that's why it's important not to use a Band-Aid approach to climate devastation in these communities, because if we don't fix those racial inequalities, those structural inequalities, then we're using a Band-Aid approach. That is why people often say, if you're going to deal with climate change, it's a racial justice issue. And in order to deal with climate change, it must be connected to racial justice. And I think people are slow to pick up on that, but any other method that doesn't try to address the long-standing structural inequities that make these communities more vulnerable to climate change will not work. We'll be spinning our wheels because, once again, they are Band-Aid approaches. So climate justice has come up over the past few years to discuss the need to be much more inclusive and intersectional, because the typical climate change narrative is very Euro-Western and often doesn't consider some of the issues I talked about. So we know that climate change and resource shortages not only hit these communities, Indigenous, Black communities, other low-income communities, first and worst, but they also impact people, or men and women, very differently. So along with race, we need to look at issues of gender. We need to look at issues of class. We need to look at issues of disability. We need to look at issues related to elderly populations, because those social identities create vulnerabilities in many ways, and they often intersect as well. So a climate justice framework says we need to frame these issues around an intersectional approach that looks at how these various social identities intersect and produce vulnerability for certain individuals. So the climate change movement in Canada, I don't think, has yet to really embrace a climate justice framework. I see the term climate justice used often, but when I delve deeper into it, they're not talking about intersectionality. They're not talking about race enough. They're not talking about how the merging of these various social identities create these vulnerabilities. And that's really important. If we are going to engage in climate policy, then we have to have the right lens, right, before we engage in that. And that means that the communities that, once again, are hit first or worst need to be involved in climate policy. So that is what climate justice is about. It's about, let's look at the communities that are most vulnerable, but let's do that through an intersectional approach. And, you know, when I say it connects to environmental racism, once again, the communities that lack power, that are in isolated communities, that are often not invited to the table, what we see over time is that, except when I talk later about some of the wins, we see over time that they often don't get redressed for the same reasons as communities that are hit by climate devastation. They don't get redressed because they're not involved in decision making, because they lack power, because they lack the resources, because they live in communities where they're often not heard. So that, for me, is how those two issues intersect. I want to talk a little bit about what the project that I've been doing since 2012 has been engaged in to address primarily environmental racism, but to some extent climate change. I'm not in the climate change space, I would say. I mean, I have a bit of an analysis, which I just shared, with you, but my work has been specifically around pollution and contamination. But I'm slowly, gradually getting into climate change. Obviously, it's the most pressing issue of our time. So I'm interested in climate change, but I'm only interested in it from the perspective of climate justice, because I think that's a framework that needs to be used. So as I mentioned earlier, in the spring of 2012, I founded the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, the ENRICH project, and I wanted it to be community-based and community engaged. I wanted it to look at the ecological, health, political, and social impacts of environmental racism. And I wanted it to be collaborative and partnered and interdisciplinary and intersectional and multi-sectoral and multimedia. Well, to be honest with you, I didn't think of those things at the beginning. I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking that I need partners, and I needed to be community-based, because at that point I wasn't, certainly not an expert on environmental issues. So of course I need partners to fill in the gaps. But it's only in the past few years that I realized that there's some kind of path that I'm following that I didn't know I was. As I started to do more presentations, I started to see a pattern of what I was doing, that it was multimedia, that it was multi this and multi that, and that I was following a path that I didn't realize. And it's only when I started to prepare presentations, I said to myself, oh, there's a rhyme and reason for this that I've been doing. Something has been guiding me down a path, but I didn't realize it until I saw it on paper. So now it kind of makes more sense what I've been doing, although I have to say to you that I was in the beginning throwing things against the wall to see what stuck. And now things make sense. So it's interesting, something, sometimes when you think about, that word serendipity, to be honest with you, this is how I think this project, the ENRICH project, has evolved because of serendipity, because some of the things that have happened, I don't quite understand. So I just think it's meant to be, and I just put one foot in front of the other. I'm guided, don't always know where I'm going, but I keep going. What I found to be the most important at the beginning was raising awareness, because I started this project in Nova Scotia and I found that a lot of people hadn't heard of the term. Now, there were activists, certainly mobilizing around this issue way before I came to Nova Scotia. I'm not taking any credit for the term environmental racism, but I'm not sure whether or not they were using the term environmental racism or not, because I wasn't in Nova Scotia at the time. But I felt that a lot of journalists that I was speaking with and members of the public were like, environmental racism, what's that? And I spent a lot of time explaining it. And I said to myself, well, if I really want people to be empathic, if I want to incite action, if I want people to mobilize, then in order to do that, you have to raise awareness. You have to inform people. They're not going to be empathic about an issue that they just don't get. And I felt that at the beginning, they just didn't get it. I was receiving emails where people were saying to me, well, why environmental racism? Isn't this really about class? It's not a race issue, right? So I spent a lot of time on email just responding to people's queries. People were never hostile, but they were very curious. So over the years, I have, and I continue to do, public engagement events and workshops, speaking events, because I find that there's always someone who doesn't understand this term. I have to say, though, that over the past several years, I think people are getting it now, and not just in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, I think a lot of them know about this issue more than other parts of Canada, to be honest. But I've noticed that over the past 3 years, people are engaging with this term environmental racism, just judging from the invitations I get across Canada, where people are asking me or saying to me that they are organizing an event around environmental racism, which never happened 8 years ago, right? I had to fit into talks on sustainability or talks on climate justice, but now I'm seeing that people are organizing events around environmental racism specifically. So that pleases me to no end, that people are picking up on this term and understanding the term. So, I've done film screenings and public engagement events and workshops, and of course I attend academic forums, et cetera, just because I want to inform people. And because I think when I hold these events, it tends to mobilize people. I often get students, typically, and young people who sit in the audience at these events, and then they want to help, right? They want to volunteer their time because the topic excites them and they want to find a way to help. The project has also become very multimedia, which isn't something that I necessarily planned, but I have to say that I have a creative soul. I love film and I love anything creative. And once again, this is something that wasn't planned, but it just kind of naturally evolved that in order for me to share information, to raise awareness in an interesting way, beyond just a book or a publication and all the things that professors do, how can I make this topic that some people might think is very dry, because I certainly did when I started the project, make it interesting through multimedia. And I've done that in several ways, but I don't have time to talk about that, but I will talk about the map. The map that was created for me by a health geography student back in 2016 that really got a lot of traction. Before he created this map, as I said, I received emails from doubters, people who really doubted the reality of environmental racism. So this student said to me, well, why don't we provide evidence on a map? And I said, well, what would that entail? He said, well, I would use GIS analysis and I would map cases of environmental racism across Nova Scotia to show very clearly where the pulp and paper mills and incinerators and dumps, et cetera, are near to Indigenous and Black communities. And he cautioned me, he said, and this map isn't saying that white communities are not near dumps, but it is saying that Black and Indigenous communities are disproportionately near dumps. So this is just a photo, what you see here, but if you go on to the Enrich website, you will see that the map has two layers, one for Mi'kmaq communities, the Indigenous communities of Nova Scotia, and another layer for African Nova Scotian communities. What he also did was he did an annotated bibliography of health risks using primarily the EPA website. So this map comes with an annotated bibliography of the materials that you would find within, for example, a dump, and then the health risks associated with the substances, in particular dump sites or waste sites. What has really been exciting is to move into film, because I personally, as I said, I love film. And in 2018, at the end of 2018, I was receiving a lot of kind of action on my Twitter page, my Enriched Twitter page, and I didn't think much of it. I did at the time notice a new follower by the name of Elliot Page, but didn't think much of it. So went about my business. And then 3 weeks later, I was like, there's that Elliot Page again. And this Elliot Page is promoting my book and talking about the Enrich Project and wanting to support the women on the front lines of the grassroots organizing happening in Nova Scotia. And I was like, what's going on here? Is this the Elliot Page from Inception? Is this the Elliot Page from Juno? Is this the Elliot Page from X-Men? And I said, I guess it is. I don't know why he's following me, but I obviously should be reaching out to thank him because he's promoting my book. And I did. And his friend who owns a restaurant in Nova Scotia called the Wooden Monkey arranged for the three of us to have a three-way call at the end of December 2018. All I know is that Elliot said, I want to find a way to use my platform, my celebrity, to help in any way I can. And we were all not sure what that meant. For me, I said to myself, well, he's got 2 million Twitter followers, and I have, at that time, I had about 2,000. And I said to myself, well, Twitter is powerful. So the best thing he could do to help really is for me to think about a campaign to support the people on the front lines of the grassroots organizing happening in Nova Scotia. And perhaps he can tweet that out. Perhaps Elliot can tweet that out, and that's going to be really helpful. Or imagine if the communities I'm working with, which they often do, they send out a GoFundMe page because they're raising legal fees. Can you imagine what that would do if Elliot tweeted that out? That's all I was thinking. And actually they did, Elliot did tweet out a GoFundMe page and it went up to like $40,000. But that's all I was thinking. So in 2019, January, we met again, this time with the grassroots grandmothers, members of the Indigenous community, the Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. And finally, we settled on video clips, 10 minutes, that we would post on Twitter And we were all squealing, we were happy, we thought finally we found something that we can do to bring more exposure to this issue. Elliot came up in April of 2019 with the co-director Ian Daniel and Elliot's personal assistant, and came to my home first, and then over the next 6 days visited the communities, and that was that. It was rough. It wasn't supposed to be sophisticated. It was guerrilla filmmaking. The camera wasn't fancy. It was about this small. It was a small camera. It wasn't supposed to be glossy because it was supposed to go on Twitter. And Elliot invited me over to his mother's home and provided me with an opportunity to look at the film, because everyone had invited me to be a co-producer, right? So I was able to look at cuts of the film, and I said to myself, this is really emotional. And I don't think posting it on Twitter is going to do this topic of environmental racism justice. We need to do something better than this. And I was the one who suggested, well, what about a feature-length film? And Ian said, you mean like 70 minutes? I said, yeah, 60, yeah, not just video clips, but a real film. And I started talking about the Berlin Film Festival and the Toronto International Film Festival, because I said, if we want this issue to gain traction and we want to create awareness, then we can't go small, we got to go big, and the Toronto Film Festival is the most important film festival in the world. We need to try to get it in there. And everybody agreed, surprisingly, and everybody had to rush back and make cuts and edits and everything. And the film, we submitted it, I think it was July of 2019, and it got in. And Elliot was kind enough to invite us all down to Toronto, paid for accommodations and flight, and I had some people at Dalhousie squeezing their way in to attend as well. So I got them tickets and my family tickets. Elliot was extremely generous. And we screened the film on September 9th, 2019. And it was one of the best times of my life. We were running around to different media outlets across the world, prime outlets like, for television, ET Canada, ET USA, the Los Angeles Times, et cetera, exactly what we want as professors. We talk often about knowledge mobilizing. Boy, was this knowledge mobilizing. Not only did we have film at TIFF, but then along with that, we had all these media outlets interviewing us. So this is what we want, because this mobilizes people. It creates excitement about an issue. And then, of course, we found out that it would go to Netflix. I already knew that this would happen, but it was finalized in October of 2019, and it's been streaming on Netflix since March 29th, 2020. In addition to the film and screenings and all of these issues, I continue to use media because I think media is really, really powerful. Obviously, I use everything at my disposal, podcasts, television, newspapers, etc., because I think this is something I need to continue to do. I need to continue to inform and create awareness. It can be exhausting, but I noticed that when media picks up on this story of environmental racism, things tend to happen, and everything is connected. If I want a bill to get passed, then I need media attention. Everything is connected. So I need to, in many ways, I need to keep this on the radar. If for me, the most important thing is to get a bill passed, then this needs to continue to happen. Of course, I do research as well. I do research, and some of it is community-based research. It depends on the topic. I do a lot of research, but I want to talk about the research that I'm doing currently with the McMaster professors and also Dalhousie professors. This is a dream because it's multidisciplinary. We've got people who are cancer biologists and statisticians and planners. Myself, I'm a sociologist. We've got a nurse on board. We've got somebody who's a toxicologist. And this is a grant that requires an interdisciplinary team, of course. And this project is called Genes and Geography, Disparities in Cancer Incidence and Outcomes in a Black Canadian Community. This Black Canadian community is Shelburne. Now, the community in Shelburne, the Black community, has said, we know for a fact that high rates of cancer is due to that landfill. But what we want to do with this research is to say, okay, yeah, maybe, but we've got to also look at lifestyle factors like smoking, and physical exercise. We've also got to look at nutrition. We've also got to look at genetics and African ancestry. Is there something about that creates high rates of cancer? We've got to look at the social determinants of health, like race and socioeconomic status. And yes, we have to look at the dump. So we are looking at these factors to see the role that they're playing or not playing in high rates of cancer in Shelburne, because we think obviously that's the responsible thing to do. It's one thing to say, yeah, I know it's the dump, but this is something that needs to be explored. So I'm very excited about this particular project. Of course, I have to publish, and I wrote my first book ever in 2018. It came out in April of 2018, and this is really about the story of my Enrich project, the challenges I experienced. I give voice to the communities. I talk about the community's struggles over the past several decades, their achievements. In chapter 5, I focus specifically on the health effects of environmental racism, including the psychological impacts, which is often not discussed. And I also talk about the legislation that I've tried to pass. At that point, it was just one in 2015 in Nova Scotia. So it's kind of my journey through the Enrich project, my journey trying to address this very, very difficult topic. I've also felt that it's important to give communities a win, right? You have to give back to the community. It's not about taking from them and doing research and taking data and not doing anything. I met a hydrogeologist after one of my events, and he says, why don't we give the communities a win? And I said, what do you mean by a win? He said, well, let's test their water. You know, the research you're doing is great, and the legislation, all that's great. But in order to keep these communities invested, we need to give them a win. And when he said water testing, I said to him, I said, well, I'm not a hydrogeologist, I'm a sociologist. How am I going to do water testing? He said, Ingrid, I'm happy to build a team around you. That would include myself, another environmental scientist, environmental science student, and we got that team together. It was a working group in 2016, and we started kind of looking at things like water testing. We did the very first water testing project in Lincolnville in 2016, and it went really well. And of course, we do this work at no cost, because these are low-income communities that don't want the government to test their water because they don't trust the government. They think the government is going to say everything is a-okay. So they don't feel that way about us. Of course, we're independent of government. So we did that work, of course, at no cost, tested the water, got a lab to do it at no cost, went back to the community, shared the findings, wrote a report, and did a few workshops on how to manage your drinking water supply. And that project turned into an NGO that we formed in April of 2017, because we said, that Lincolnville project went really well. And why don't we turn this into a kind of a permanent organization? We now have charitable status. We didn't at the beginning. And what our mission is to address water contamination in rural Nova Scotian communities, not necessarily Indigenous or Black, any rural community. We test their water because rural communities are often on well water, and well water can be more contaminated than municipal water. So that's our mission, to do this at no cost. But also what we do is we train students, so we typically have environmental science students, and they learn how to test water. But when I talk about building capacity, we also train community members to test their own water. Probably most of us don't know how to do that. But this is about empowering communities, right, to take on projects on their own so that they can lead. So this has been an extremely successful project, and something I'm extremely proud of, because it's giving back to the community and it's tangible. And you don't have to wait for years for things to happen. It happens immediately. And 2 years ago, we started doing these Healthy Wells Workshop Day. October 18th, October 19th is when we typically hold that. And we use social media and Facebook Live and infographics and text and on-site water testing to create awareness about the need to test your well, the need to maintain a healthy well, because a lot of people have cracked wells, they have old wells, and that is a health issue when you don't know how to maintain your wells. So we do that as well. So it's just an awareness raising day where we use various platforms to get our message across. As I said, I'm not somebody who's really worked in climate change, but in 2019, I met up with some retired climate scientists, and they had done some work in Indigenous communities, and they said they wanted to do some work in the Black community in Nova Scotia. And I said, yeah, that would be great, because I feel that the Black community in Nova Scotia is really not that engaged in climate change, because people, they need to have awareness in order to be interested in something. And there were not a lot of projects going on in Black communities in Nova Scotia around climate change. There were efforts made, but they weren't that successful. Efforts made by municipal government that weren't successful. And those people were calling on me, can you help us engage the Black community? And I was like really busy, and because they didn't know how to do it, right? So engagement is difficult. People have to feel that the issue is personal to them. And that's why I feel the climate change messaging right now in general in Canada, around the world, isn't getting to people. And I don't think it's successful. We create all this urgency about it, 2030, 2030, 2030. A lot of people really don't care. We have failed in many ways because I don't think it's personal to people. So I said to myself, if I'm going to do this project on climate change with Climate Action Services, I need to identify a way to make it personal. These communities often talk about, these Black communities often talk about how much they love their community. There's so much solidarity. And the question is, if you love your community so much, what would happen if it starts the flooding that could happen? What about issues around food security? What about those personal issues that will impact you, your family, and the community you love? So I wanted to identify, first of all, what are some of the social issues that would prevent these communities from engaging in some of the things that we want them to engage in with respect to climate mitigation, for example? What are some of the historical factors that prevent them from doing that, like lack of resources? What are some of the political factors? What about the fact that many of them don't have these networks that they can call on? I wanted to identify all those kinds of things that they lack, and to identify the things that they need, and to provide them with a network of people. These, once again, are isolated rural communities that are not connected to government in many ways, right? Or networks of professionals. And that's what I wanted to do with these workshops. And there was not a lot of enthusiasm. I've heard, that people didn't want to participate. But then after the workshops, people loved it. They said they want more. They couldn't believe that how much they enjoyed this topic because we made it personal. So they are asking for more. And I guess my next step would be, how can I do something a little bit more sustainable in these communities? I've done a lot of education and training. As I mentioned earlier, the Enrich project is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And that was highlighted for me 4 or 5 years into my project, when students in almost every single discipline at Dalhousie, they were reaching out to me wanting to be involved in the Enrich project. And I said to myself, wow, this is, if I'm getting a sociology student and a political science student and a student in the law school and a student in medicine and a student in nursing and a student in sociology and a student in geography and in planning, and all of these students from these different departments are interested in this one topic, then this is truly interdisciplinary. And that means that perhaps the solutions to environmental racism are interdisciplinary, right? So this has been, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of the Enrich project, is because I get to learn from students in different disciplines. I get to learn from professors in different disciplines. And hopefully, of course, they learn from me. What they wanted mostly from me is an opportunity to actually meet the communities on the ground, because of course they're sitting in their classes, hearing about Alton Gas, hearing about Pictou Land and First Nation, but never having met members of the community. It probably is a very distant issue for them. So through me and through some of the relationships I had formed with the communities on the ground, they wanted to meet communities. They wanted to go up to the Treaty Truck House and meet Doreen Bernard, who's one of the grassroots grandmothers, right? So I was able to give them that opportunity to do that. But at the same time, I learned from them. And of course, they helped me with literature reviews, because as professors, we always need an annotated bibliography or a literature review, right? Because I hate doing them. So yeah, so this has been really, really great to see just the excitement that students have had around this issue of environmental racism from different disciplines. Legal remedies is part of kind of what I do. I don't get deep into this, but there is an organization called Eco Justice across Canada. You've got an office in Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, maybe other areas, but they opened an office in 2018 in Halifax, and I got very excited because I had formed a relationship with the Calgary office in 2016 to help Lincolnville look at legal remedies. So when they opened up an office in Halifax, I went straight down and met with the lawyers there, and I said, well, these are the communities I've been working with. I just want to tell you more about them. And they started working with these communities. I don't quite know what's going on because I'm not privy to that information legally. I know a little bit about what's happening with Shelburne because Louise DeLeo, the leader there, revealed a few things to me a few days ago. But basically, I kind of leave this alone and I let the communities deal with this. But they look at legal remedies such as private prosecution, perhaps a class action lawsuit, although I was told that there's no precedent for that in Canada around environmental issues. But this was something I thought was really important because many of the communities I work with say we want to take legal action. So I just connected them. Environmental justice legislation is really important for me. I think if we don't have environmental justice legislation, I think this is a very difficult issue to tackle. I've been trying to get environmental justice legislation passed since 2015 with Lenore Zan, who you see on the screen. She was an MLA in Nova Scotia. She was an MP, Liberal, up until last year when she lost her seat, unfortunately. But we have been partners in crime since 2015, trying to get a bill passed. We introduced Bill 111 in 2015, a provincial Nova Scotia bill. It went all the way to second reading, but was defeated. Then she contacted me in February of 2020, and she said, why don't we take that 2015 bill and change it and update it and modify it and turn it into a federal bill? I said, of course, this is great. We can go beyond Nova Scotia. We can look at all of Canada. So she did that. She introduced it on February 26, 2020. It went to second reading. It was approved, and it went to amendments and was approved by all parties except the Conservatives. And I think it was on its way to becoming legislation. However, when the snap election was called last year, it died on the order paper, as do all private members' bills. But we keep trying. You probably heard of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That's something that I also support. I'm connected to people who are focused on this particular bill. So launching campaigns with them, collaborating on campaigns, some of the things that we do, writing op-eds and trying to get the attention of government. In addition to the Enrich Project, I co-founded the Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice at the end of 2020 with a partner in Toronto. And how this is different from the Enrich Project, well, it's more of a coalition. It's about getting people in the organizations in the environmental and climate space to collaborate to find solutions to climate change and environmental racism. Folks from David Suzuki Foundation, Climate Action Network, Eco Justice, Kairos, which is a religious organization, the Canadian Black Trade Union. We've got probably over 60 different organizations now on board, and we are focused on very specific projects like mapping. A map for all of Canada is something that we're looking at. I showed you the Enrich map, but we are actually developing right now a map that indicates or maps cases of environmental racism and climate change devastation across Canada. So that's something I'm very excited about. We launch campaigns to support legislation. We are in the process of restructuring this organization right now from working groups to projects. So in March, we should have all of that defined and refined. But this has been really exciting to engage in this work. I think I saw Sherry Stevenson on this call. Sherry is probably there. So thank you, Sherry. Sherry has been a volunteer on the coalition, working on the education and training working group, and another working group, which escapes me right now. I'm getting very old. Okay, so what are some of the wins? Because as I said, I think this is a really difficult, I have felt that this is a very difficult topic and that I've been spinning my wheels is how I've been feeling over the past 9 years. And I realized that if I feel that way, well, can you imagine the communities who have been dealing with this long before I started this project? They've been dealing with this for decades, but it just makes me feel like, oh, I'm spinning my wheels because there seems to be no redress around issues of environmental racism and climate change for some reason. But interestingly enough, over the past, I guess, 2 years, despite these challenges, there have been wins. And I just want to kind of quickly talk about those wins. So I mentioned Sipekne'katik First Nation. I mentioned that Alton Gas was preparing to implement a brine discharge project in Sipekne'katik First Nation in Nova Scotia, and that has been kind of going on since 2014. The community has been resisting successfully. I've admired the community in terms of how they've used their social media platform, but also the Treaty Truck House, a site in the community to actually educate people about this issue, but also to engage in resistance activities. And although it took maybe 6-7 years for this project to be canceled, I think the mobilizing of the Mi'kmaq community has just been stunning to watch. And I just feel too, like when I think back, I was watching history. I mean, there was an article in Maclean's about the grassroots grandmothers recently, and I was like, yeah, it feels so great to know that I was watching history. So that project was canceled in October of last year. Alton Gas claims that they've moved on to other things. That's what they say, but I guess they're tired, they're exhausted because the community has done such a great job of resisting. So they're probably just tired. Pictou Landing First Nation, at the end of January 2020, as I mentioned, the pulp mill that had been dumping effluent into Boat Harbour since 1967 closed because the government said, we gave you 5 years to tell us how you are going to treat the water, and you came back with a plan that is not sufficient. So we cannot keep making broken promises to this community. So the mill is going to close. That was drama because in February of 2020, there were threats directed at the community, threats directed at Chief Andrea Paul. People said that they were going to drive her daughter off the road. It was not a very nice time in Nova Scotia because people lost their jobs. When the mill was closed, people lost their jobs. And the announcement, was made at Christmas time, 2019. So I get it. I get why people are angry. But then when I compare that to the fact that this is a community that has had to deal with this toxic site since 1967, of course, I'm on the side of the community. Sorry. Grassy Narrows First Nation, 6 decades after tons of mercury was dumped into the Wabigoon River, Grassy Narrows First Nation reached an agreement in Ottawa in July 2021 last year for $68.9 million more in funding to build a home that will care for people experiencing the health impacts of the chemicals. So I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, there was also multi-billion dollars given to the community for cleanup. But what people don't often realize is that you can clean up a community, but the health impacts remain, right? So it's not ever over because there are health effects. So this particular agreement here is about dealing with the health effects with respect to Grassy Narrows First Nation. Africville, the Black community I talked about, that was an example of gentrification and environmental racism. They have never really received redress. In November 2016, 300 descendants of Africville called on the Supreme Court because they wanted to launch a class action lawsuit. That was in 2016. In 2018, it was thrown out. It was thrown out because the judge felt that there was not enough information provided by the community. Since then, the community has engaged in various protest actions. In 2020, at the end of 2020, they walked or marched through the streets of Halifax asking for reparations. I don't think they've heard back. Lincolnville has always wanted the landfill to be redirected. That's probably never going to happen. I hate to say that. It's not going to be redirected anywhere. But I think the water testing project that we did is I'm hoping gives them some kind of solace, because now they know what's in their water for the first time and they know how to manage it. This is an elderly community in Lincolnville. They're tired. And I can see that they're tired because I call on them often and I don't hear from them. And I get it, right? They've been trying to deal with this issue since 1974. It's an elderly population. And I don't think they've given up necessarily, but, and I think there's hope, but it's very hard to mobilize them. But I'm always willing to take up the fight again anytime they wish, but I have felt that they kind of moved on, unfortunately. Shelburne, which is in the film, by the end of 2016, the dump was finally closed. It opened in 1943, stunning achievement. In addition to that, they formed the first NGO they've ever formed, the South End Environmental Injustice Society, SEED. And since they formed SEED in early 2016, they have gotten so many things done. They got the well, they got the dump closed. They got the Housing Authority to gift them with 6 wells. Elliot Page gifted them with a community well. They had water testing done through the Enrich Project and partners. They've had an ultrafiltration project done to clean out the water. The well is now being implemented or installed that Elliot Page gave them after a lot of trouble from their town council that refused to install that well for 2 years. So for me, this is a real win. And I spoke with the leader there, Louise, a few days ago, and she's extremely happy. I said to her, are you planning to launch any kind of legal action? She said, perhaps, but right now we are just so happy that we have a chance to get clean water because that well is being installed and the community has a real chance, at least in the future, of better health, right? So that is what she's focused on right now. But I would say that this is somebody, Louise, who has impressed me since 2015 when I met her, what she's accomplished in that community with the help, of course, of others, but with her leading these projects. She's a really prime example of how well things can go if you allow and you make space and you get out of the way so that community members can lead projects. And that's what happened in Shelburne. So those are some of the wins that I'd like to share with you. And I'm going to end my talk right now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron. That was very exciting. Lots of work, lots of impact. It actually sounds like you've had multiple lives. Congratulations. Just because of our time, I'll get to the questions soon. But I just wanted to say that I really like the education, media and movie, legislation, capacity building, and other ways you've really made your work accessible to people, to common folks, to communities, right? Scholars tend to write, especially in a field like mine, law, we tend to write in jargons, and it makes it very difficult for people that are impacted by our work, to really know what we're talking about. So I really like your work in that sense. And, like you, I'm one of those who believe that scholars should be doing more, not just publishing and just writing papers that end up in bookshelves that nobody reads, right? So it's great to really see that. It's very inspiring. So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, and we also have a few questions from the people that have joined us today. But I'll start with some of the questions specifically in your field, right? So I'll start with the first one. So what has your work revealed about the health effects of environmental racism in Indigenous and Black communities? I guess you could focus more on Canada, right? You've done a lot of work in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, all or most of these communities would say that higher rates of cancer, rare cancer, skin problems, skin diseases, gastrointestinal issues, autism, actually, reproductive health issues, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. Many of them would say that these are linked to toxins, toxic burdens. And scholars over the past, I guess, 20 years in Canada have suggested that strongly. And it makes sense that if you belong to a community that tends to be spatially clustered around these waste disposal sites, that high rates of cancer and other illnesses would be connected to that. So that's what many studies in Canada has shown. And just in terms of the communities I met with, this is what they talked about. I remember meeting with an Indigenous elder in what's the community? Member two. And he talked, this was back in 2012 when I was doing those regional workshops to meet community members. And he said, autism, I believe autism is connected to environmental racism. I have to say, I thought, oh, that's a bit That's wild. Because I was seeing autism as something very different, and toxins being responsible for autism, that's a bit out of the box, I thought to myself. And then it was 3 years ago, I saw a paper from a very prestigious American journal that talked about the link between toxins and autism. So I was like, oh, he was right. Because I thought it was just a bit ludicrous because of how I understood autism, and I had worked with an autistic child a long time ago, but he was right, so what I'm doing with this study, I talked about genes and geography, is to really disentangle these issues, because I think to be responsible in terms of being a researcher is to not just jump to the conclusion that, yes, the dump, right? The communities are sure about it, and I want to give credence to communities, but I think it's responsible to say, well, what is it? Because yes, it could be the dump, but there's so many confounding factors, like smoking, like all these issues that we also have to talk about. I often say that environmental racism is a gendered issue, particularly a gendered health issue, because there are very specific ways in which, for example, women are impacted by environmental racism. So when I look at a community like Amjinwang First Nation, we see high rates of reproductive illnesses. That, of course, will impact women. Reproductive cancers, infertility, premature menopause, premature births, compromised immune system, so what even, having children and knowing that they're not going to be living in healthy environments, so they're going to be in compromised environments in terms of health. All these issues are real and are gendered. So I think it's also important to complicate the issue of health, to look at the gendered health effects. One book that I love that really educated me on this is by a professor at York University called Dana Scott. And she wrote a book called Our Chemical Cells. And she talked about the gendered pathways through which contaminants get into the body, and how socially constructed notions of occupations and where people are located, the jobs that people do, of course, that are either predominantly male or female, and how that exposes you to different contaminants. Like, that book really educated me about having a much more gendered analysis of pollution and the impacts on the body. So that's something that I think is really important for people to consider as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I've met Dana as well. That's always good. She's great. So yeah, I was just wondering, when you were talking so far, I know the project you're doing now will likely give some of the communities some kind of evidence, right? Scientific evidence to ask questions and to take action, right? So far, have you seen similar research doing that for people? So maybe research in your area, helping people actually ask governments and take them to courts and things like that.
I haven't encountered that. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but the way that I guess my project has evolved and the kind of multiple angles it's taken, it's like me once again throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, because I think there are multiple ways to address environmental racism. I haven't encountered anybody doing that, but there are people who are doing pieces of it. There are people who, but through a research study, the professors that I meet who are in climate science or environmental science, they're much more interested in pollution and contamination and talking about that. My social, sociological, community-based approach is not something that I've encountered, but I'm happy to say that I am constantly being, I'm constantly being sent emails by students or graduate students who want to do what I'm doing. So I think in the future, we will see more people using a multi-method approach, a multi-sectoral approach, an interdisciplinary approach, an intersectional approach, a multimedia approach, because they're seeing my project perhaps as a model or blueprint. So that makes me excited.
That's great. So the reason I asked that question is we have a similar problem in climate, right? So one of the biggest challenges in climate change and addressing climate justice is the problem of proving causation, right, and liability. So something happens at a particular place. How do you connect that thing that happened to the effects that you see, maybe diseases and things like that. And one of the greatest things recently that scientists have done is to create something they call attribution science. So it's still very young, but we're hoping that attribution science is going to help to connect those together, right? The cause and the effect. So that was the reason I asked that question. So I'll go to the next question. So what do you see as the top 3 most effective ways to address environmental racism in Canada?
You have to have legislation. I think if you don't have legislation, it can't be addressed, really. You have to have 3 things. You've got to have legislation, you have to have community mobilizing to bring attention to it, and you've got to have education. You know, I think of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think, wow, it does a great job in terms of creating awareness in the media. It's a visceral issue, somebody's hand around somebody's neck. Yes, people can see it. But then what I found problematic about BLM is that it never is sustained. You get the street marches and the protests, but it has to move through policy. And if you don't connect it to policy quickly, before people forget all about it, and right now we're not really talking about BLM like we did in 2020, and I had a feeling that that would happen, that we would move on to other things, is because it needs to be sustained through policy. So I think for environmental racism, the mobilizing that I've seen that Indigenous and Black communities have done around this issue is stunning. They've been doing it for decades. And that's important. It brings attention in the media, it brings awareness to people in the public so they can empathize with the issue, so it can incite them to action. Very important. But if it's not followed by legislation, which is what I'm trying to pass, then I'm not saying it's meaningless, but it's difficult for it to be sustained. Now, we have some wins, as I indicated, but it took so long for those wins to happen, right? Pictou Landing First Nation since 1967. The Alton gas issue since 2014. Shelburne since 1942. Like, it's taken so long. And I think legislation would speed that up. So right now I'm trying to get a government bill passed. You probably heard of Elizabeth May's bill that came out last week. And I am supportive of it, but private members' bills typically are not successful. So I'm trying to get the Minister of Environment to introduce a government bill that tends to pass through Parliament more quickly. So I'm getting ready to launch a campaign to encourage him to introduce a government bill rather than a private member's bill. So I think legislation is important. Because in his mandate letter, it says we want to clean up these toxic sites. We want to create an environmental justice strategy. We want to do a bill. Like, he had these 3 points, and I said, this is in line with a bill. So let's hope he does it. Education is important. Who's making the decisions right now about environmental issues and where projects get placed? Who makes those decisions? Typically white members of the elite, right? And they make decisions based on what they know. They make decisions based on their experiences, their norms, their values, et cetera, et cetera. We need more information about these issues in the schools, in elementary schools up to secondary schools, on climate justice and environmental racism. Yes, sustainability is discussed in the schools, but sustainability is not environmental racism. It's very, very different, because environmental racism is about power. It's about power and it's about racism, and sustainability often glosses over those issues. Environmental racism opens a space to talk about colonialism, neoliberalism, capitalism, racism, right? So we need that to be embedded in the school curriculum early on. And I'm actually involved in a project right now with the Black Council for Windsor, Essex, Ontario, to embed these topics into the school curriculum. I applied for funding for this, but even if I don't get the funding, I think there are ways we can go ahead and do it without funding, actually, because I've got people on the other side who are part of the school system and they know exactly what to do. So I would say those 3 things: education, meaning embedding in the curriculum, in elementary school, of course at universities, this discourse on environmental racism that does not shy away from issues of power and race, and doesn't make it all about class, because it's not just about class. Then you are educating the future generation. It's the young people who are most, like you, who are most enthusiastic about these issues, right? So you put that, you give them the analytical, intellectual tools by informing them through the curriculum. they're going to be the future leaders, and they're going to make what I consider to be considered decisions. I'm not saying the decisions that I think are right, but decisions that are considered decisions, because they are the future.
Wow, that's intense. And yeah, like I was saying, right, you have impact across these forms of engagement and instruments, which is great. Another one I was thinking about when you were talking, especially if you think about the US, they have also used a lot of litigation, right, in environmental justice. But I mean, US is also a unique place, right, because it's probably the most litigious place in the world. Yeah. So that's, I don't know if that's going to work in Canada. I'm pretty sure they've used it in Canada, but I don't know how much impact that has in Canada so far. Probably not a lot of impact, but yeah, don't quote me on that. So I'll ask the next question. And the next question is, you have used a community-based approach to address environmental racism. Can you discuss and provide an example of tangible impacts that have resulted from this approach? I mean, I think you've actually mentioned some of them. Are there others you want to add?
Well, I think the ideal would be Shelburne, because it's the way that you want to see things go when you do community-based research and when you empower communities to take on the issues themselves and you allow them to fly. And Shelburne, for me, what I've seen with what Louise has done since 2015, I'm stunned by it. It came out of my approach that's community-based. So I met with Louise because I knew that if focus groups were to be done in her community around environmental racism and its health impacts, then it should be done by community, not by me, not by a professor that they didn't know walking into their community. Why would they want to come to a focus group that Ingrid Waldron is facilitating? They had no idea who I was. So I said, I'm going to get somebody who's well-liked. Louise was a longtime activist. She was well-liked and respected, not by everybody, because when she started doing the work, people were against her. They thought she was making trouble. Let's just be a quiet Black community. Stop making trouble. We don't want all this attention, right? So she had a lot of hostility directed towards her by Black people in her own community. There was division, but she was generally well-liked. So she did those workshops. And when she did those workshops, when you get people together in a group and they start to become aware, they start to get incensed. They're like, so this dump is in our community and it's doing this and the cancer rates and blah, blah, blah. When you get people together, then they start mobilizing. They're like, no way, this can't happen to us. And that is exactly what happened. They rose up after the focus groups were finished in January of 2016. They formed the NGO, the ENGO. They got Nova Scotia Environment to address an oil spill in June. I went to the community and did a town hall to explain what environmental racism was to the community. There's a lot of people there with questions. At the end of 2016, they got the dump closed for the first time, as I said. They got a water testing project done by the Enrich Project. They got an ultrafiltration project done. They got a free well from Elliot Page. They got Housing Nova Scotia to give them 6 wells. They got an ultrafiltration project done to clean out their well. The things that have happened in that community, one after the other, happens when you do community-based research right, which is that you are not leading it. You are not in charge. You give the communities the tools, the resources, maybe the resources are financial, and you allow them to fly. And whenever anybody asks me about my project, I say that Shelburne is the ideal scenario. Of course, I had a leader who was willing. This is somebody who was retired. She's in her late 60s. She should be resting, right? She was retired. But when you find the right person and you give them the tools and the resources, they can fly. They don't need me anymore. In the beginning, I was like, okay, this is a person I want to introduce you to. This is what, they don't need me anymore, right? They are empowered. They have the networks now. They know who to call on. Perfect scenario. It doesn't always happen. I wish it happened for Lincolnville, but as I said, they're tired. It didn't happen for them. So yeah, I can't tell you how pleased I am to know Louise and to see what she has done.
Thank you so much. We have so many questions, but I guess a lot of people are excited about this. Unfortunately, we cannot get to all the questions. You've actually answered some of the questions from the audience. So for instance, there's someone asking about a message you would send to the next generation of climate change leaders. I mean, you already mentioned something in that regard when you were using me as an example, so that's great. So we don't have enough time to answer all the questions. I think what I'm gonna do is to say that people that have really burning questions can send them to you directly if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, please feel free to send those questions directly to her and should be able to answer your question. Thank you so much for your time. And at this point, I think I'm gonna hand things over to Pablo. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. Okay, Pablo, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. That was absolutely inspiring and reinvigorating, and just the type of conversation and presentation I was really hoping to hear. And I'm sure everyone who's stuck around for all of it is feeling the same way. So just want to thank you again for taking time out of your busy days to share. We also want to thank Elder Larry Grant for welcoming us and starting this event in this week in such a good way. And we also want to thank all of the amazing climate, I'm just going to share my screen here. We just want to thank all of the amazing Climate Emergency Week planning team members. This could not happen without you. Thank you to our amazing communications team and to all the volunteers who are holding down Sustainability Hub and Climate Hub booths. We also want to thank PICS and UBC Wellbeing for funding support for this week's events. So we really hope you're feeling inspired from Dr. Waldron's talk and with having Temi as well. And hope you feel called to action after today's event as well. As you saw, there were some calls to action that Dr. Waldron shared. There's also some other ways to get involved, some more ways to learn, including reading about the Climate Emergency Task Force report for UBC and tracking the progress of UBC's response. And we'll link these in the chat as well. Also to check out the Sustainability Hub's new strategic plan, which was just launched today. And also head to your nearest library on campus if you're at UBC or on the library website to find curated materials put together by the library climate action team. If you're looking for climate courses across UBC to enroll in next term, you can head to our Sustain website and check out the Climate Hub's programs and events, and also sign up for their newsletter and social media. And for urgent calls to action, CJUBC is calling on support from all of you to endorse their letter, calling on UBC to permanently fund the climate emergency in their next budget cycle and beyond. Sierra Club of BC is also encouraging people to sign an open letter, calling on the BC government to confront the climate emergency. And in exciting, very local news here in our building, the Food Security Initiative and partners are opening a new low-cost grocery store launching at the Sears building on the Vancouver campus, where the Loop Cafe used to be, if you're familiar with that. And they're opening this Wednesday, February 16th from 1 to 7, and they'll be open to all UBC faculty, students, and staff from Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, 1 to 7 p.m. And save the date. They have a launch celebration on Wednesday, March 2nd. So lastly, this is Climate Emergency Week. So there's a whole week of events, and you can find them on the website for Climate Emergency Week. If you're at the UBC Vancouver campus, there's pop by the climate kiosk at the Nest and Sustainability Hub tent at the Martha Piper Fountain on Main Mall tomorrow. And students, you can join us for this Voice and Vision student roundtables tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. to share your ideas and input on where UBC should continue to go to address the climate emergency. So with that, I just would like to again thank everyone for joining us. Thank you also to Nadia for starting us off also in the beginning, and for all your support on this event. And yeah, have a beautiful rest of your evening, everyone.